Tonight, you are listening to Mythwalker Archives, a quiet place for stories that move slowly, breathe deeply, and remember what the waking world often forgets. And in this gentle hour, as the edges of thought begin to soften, we invite you into a calm and reflective exploration titled South Asian Folk Darkness. The quiet myths that watched the night, a journey not through fear, but through understanding, not through alarm, but through the long memory of the human mind. Because long before light was something we could summon at will, darkness was not merely the absence of vision. It was a condition of listening, a time when the world seemed to lean closer, when the mind learned to notice patterns, pauses, and presences that daylight drowned out. And across early villages, forests, riverbanks, and open fields, people quietly sensed that night carried rules different from day, boundaries that were not written but felt, warnings that arrived not as commands but as sensations. And it is here, in this unhurried space between awareness and rest, that ancient myths began their work, not to frighten, but to teach the nervous system how to stay alive, how to recognize when stillness had meaning, how to understand that silence after midnight meant something, even if no words explained what that something was. And so we begin not with a creature or a legend, but with a question that early humans did not speak aloud, yet felt deeply. Why does darkness feel as though it remembers us? Why does the body respond before the mind decides? And why do so many cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, describe night as watchful rather than empty in South Asian folk memory? Darkness was often understood as occupied, not crowded, but attentive, a presence that noticed movement, sound, and intention. And in this way, night whispers were taken seriously, not because they promised harm, but because they suggested that the world continued its quiet activity even when sight withdrew. And as you rest with this thought, you may notice how the modern mind still responds in similar ways, how silence in an unfamiliar room feels different from silence at home, how the absence of sound can feel fuller than noise, and this response is not childish, nor irrational. It is ancient, rooted in evolutionary patterns where listening after dark meant survival. And over time, these patterns shaped stories, and the stories shaped meaning, and meaning shaped behavior, forming myths that taught when to pause, when to stay indoors, when not to speak, when not to look too closely. And in the warm regions of South Asia, where nights arrived swiftly and shadows gathered beneath trees and along paths, these lessons often took the form of quiet warnings rather than dramatic tales. Simple understandings passed through generations, such as the idea that some roads feel different when empty, or that sleeping beneath certain trees unsettles the mind, or that there are moments when the air itself seems to lean inward, asking for stillness. And these ideas were not unique, for in ancient Mesopotamia, night was also associated with unseen order and cosmic listening. In Egypt, darkness guided the soul through transformation. In Greece, twilight marked crossings between worlds. And in each place, myths did not shout. They murmured, offering symbolic language to experiences that science would one day explain, experiences rooted in pattern recognition, memory consolidation, and the brain's heightened sensitivity during low light. And yet, even with modern understanding, these feelings persist, because the subconscious does not operate by instruction manuals. It operates by inherited memory, by what Carl Jung described as archetypal residue, emotional templates carried quietly forward. And so when a shadow seems not quite human, or when a distant sound feels chosen rather than random, the response arises before logic arrives, not to terrify but to orient, to ask the question that myths have always asked gently: are you paying attention? And as this narrative unfolds over time, each story will surface slowly, not as separate tales, but as variations of a single long dream, where the woman who should not be looked at is not a monster, but a boundary, where spirits that follow empty roads are not hunters, but reminders of vulnerability, where homes marked by invisible fear are not cursed, but remembered, and where eyes watching from fields reflect the ancient relationship between human awareness and open space. And perhaps, as you sink further into rest, you may wonder why these ideas still visit us in dreams, why names you never say at night feel heavy on the tongue, why the mind prefers quiet reflection after dark. And this wondering is not meant to be answered quickly, because myths were never designed for urgency. They were designed to accompany sleep, to guide consciousness gently inward, where meaning does not demand explanation. And so, as breath deepens and thou GHTS lengthen, consider this as the first and softest truth of the night, that darkness has always been less about what waits outside and more about what awakens within, waiting patiently to be remembered. As the mind settles further and the boundary between listening and drifting begins to blur, it becomes easier to sense why night, across ancient cultures, was never treated as neutral time. Because long before lamps, clocks, and glowing screens softened its edges, darkness altered perception in subtle but powerful ways, slowing vision, sharpening hearing, and inviting the imagination to step into the spaces between certainty. And in South Asian villages, where evening arrived with a sudden hush of birds and a cooling of air, people learned that night required a gentler form of attention, not the vigilance of battle, but the awareness of presence, the kind that notices when silence changes texture. And this sensitivity shaped early myths that did not announce themselves loudly, but settled into routine behavior, shaping when doors were closed, when voices lowered, and when movement paused, because silence after midnight meant something. Though no single story claimed to fully explain it, and this understanding echoed much older human experiences, as early hunter-gatherers across the world discovered that the nervous system behaves differently after sunset, releasing hormones that deepen internal imagery while heightening the startle response, a balance designed to protect while resting. And in this space, night whispers were taken seriously, not as commands, but as signals, the rustle of leaves that arrived without wind, the distant call that did not match a bird, the subtle sound that asked for stillness rather than flight. And these moments were often shared quietly the next morning, not as tales of terror, but as confirmations that night had its own language, one spoken through pattern and absence. And in Mesopotamian tradition, darkness was believed to carry the weight of unseen gods who organized chaos into order, while in ancient China, night balanced the world through yin, restoring the harmony that day disrupted. And these beliefs, though separated by geography, emerged from the same psychological ground, the recognition that human awareness deepens when sight recedes, drawing attention inward, where memory, intuition, and imagination quietly collaborate. And this collaboration became myth not to deceive, but to translate feeling into symbol, allowing communities to pass down emotional intelligence in a form that could be remembered. And in South Asia, where oral tradition preserved not just stories but atmospheres, parents and elders often spoke less at night, allowing the quiet to teach on its own, reinforcing the idea that sound carried weight after dark. And perhaps this is why certain whispers were believed to mean something more. Why hearing your name softly spoken at night felt different from hearing it during the day. Because the brain, relaxing its analytical filters, becomes more receptive to suggestion, to internal narrative, and to ancestral memory. A phenomenon modern sleep psychology recognizes as hypnagogia, the transitional state where logic loosens and symbolism takes over. And in this state, myths function not as literal explanations, but as emotional anchors, preventing the mind from drifting into panic by offering familiar patterns. And as you listen now, in a safe and controlled present, you may notice similar sensations. How a distant sound becomes part of the narrative your mind is quietly forming. How stillness feels heavier, more intentional, and this is not a failure of reason, but it's rest, allowing deeper layers of cognition to speak, layers that once ensured survival by interpreting subtle cues. And so, when ancient stories suggested that silence itself could be meaningful, they were acknowledging a truth the body already knew, that the absence of sound sharpens awareness, making even small changes feel important. And this importance did not always imply danger. Often it implied guidance, reminding listeners when to remain indoors, when not to wander, and when to conserve energy, echoing evolutionary wisdom wrapped in symbolic language. And in Nordic lands, twilight was said to invite unseen activity, while in African folklore, night was a time when ancestors listened more closely. And these beliefs, rather than frightening, created structure, offering psychological containment for a phase of consciousness that otherwise felt too open, too unbounded. And this containment is something you may feel as the narrative continues, how each myth does not pull you outward, but gently circles inward, encouraging stillness rather than excitement. Because myths were never meant to keep humans awake. They were meant to help them sleep safely in a world they did not fully control. And so, as the night deepens within this one continuous thought, it may be worth wondering without urgency, how many of your own nighttime feelings are inherited rather than invented? How much of your response to silence is remembered rather than learned? And whether the part of you that listens most closely when the world grows quiet is not afraid at all, but simply attentive, continuing an ancient practice long after its original context has faded. As the narrative drifts further inward, the idea of boundaries begins to surface, not as walls or rules, but as subtle thresholds of awareness. And in South Asian folk memory, few boundaries were as quietly emphasized as the understanding that some things were not meant to be looked at directly, because looking was never considered a passive act. It was an exchange, a crossing of attention, and so emerged the enduring presence of the woman who should not be looked at. Not introduced as a monster or a villain, but as a figure of transgression, appearing at the edges of vision, reflected in water, glimpsed beneath trees, or sensed as a shift in the air. And her story varied by region and era, sometimes described as a widow spirit, sometimes as a forest presence, sometimes simply as a woman standing where no one should stand. Yet the central instruction remained consistent. Do not meet her gaze, not out of fear, but out of respect for what happens when awareness lingers too long on what the nervous system cannot fully process. And this idea, though local in expression, resonates with remarkable similarity across cultures, appearing in Greek myths where the gaze of Medusa turns certainty into stone, in Japanese folklore where certain yokai punish prolonged attention, and in African traditions where spirits lose balance when named or stared at, because the act of focusing attention was believed to activate the myth, transforming a passive sensation into an active experience. And from a psychological perspective, this warning aligns with the understanding that the human brain, especially at night, fills ambiguity with narrative, turning partial information into meaning. And when attention lingers on unclear shapes or movements, anxiety can escalate, creating bodily reactions that feel external rather than internal. And so the myth offered a solution. Do not look too closely. Allow ambiguity to remain ambiguous. Let the mind pass over what it does not need to resolve. And in this way, the woman who should not be looked at becomes a symbolic boundary protecting mental equilibrium, particularly in environments where darkness, fatigue, and isolation amplified perception. And Jungian psychology would later describe such figures as manifestations of the shadowed anima, not threatening in essence, but powerful in influence, representing aspects of the psyche that demand integration rather than confrontation. And this is why, in many tellings, those who glanced briefly and turned away felt no harm, while those who stared, drawn by curiosity or defiance, experienced disorientation, illness, or deep unease. Outcomes that modern cognitive science understands as the effects of hyperfocus under stress, where the mind loses its capacity to self-soothe. And as you rest with this story now, notice how your own awareness behaves in low light, how shapes soften, how imagination supplies missing detail, and how the body responds most calmly when attention remains gentle and unfixed. And this gentle attention is what these myths encouraged, an attentional style suited for night, when certainty retreats and imagination becomes collaborative rather than dominant. And similar guidance appears in Vedic thought, where the unseen aspects of reality are approached indirectly through symbol and mantra rather than direct assertion. And in indigenous American traditions, where not naming certain entities preserved balance by preventing mental fixation, all pointing toward the same quiet insight, that not everything benefits from direct observation, especially during altered states of consciousness, such as the threshold between waking and sleep. And perhaps this explains why the woman in these stories does not chase, does not call out, does not demand recognition. She simply is, her power lying not in action, but in invitation, testing whether the listener understands when to engage and when to release attention. And as this idea settles, it may evoke a calm recognition. How often the mind becomes restless by insisting on clarity when rest would be more natural. How staring too long at an unresolved thought can disturb the body, while letting it drift restores ease. And in this way, the ancient warning feels less like superstition and more like a form of cognitive care, a suggestion to trust the rhythm of consciousness, especially at night, when the mind is designed to wander softly rather than search. And so, as the figure of the woman who should not be looked at fades into symbolic distance, She leaves behind not fear, but a quiet instruction to allow the night to remain partially unseen, to let the edges blur, and to release the need to define every shadow. Knowing that rest often begins when observation gently loosens its grip. With the image of the forbidden gaze now softened into memory, the narrative lingers in the space it created, because myths rarely disappear when their figures fade. Instead, they leave behind patterns of behave, ire and feeling, subtle habits of attention that continue shaping how the mind moves through darkness. And the woman who should not be looked at becomes less a character and more a principle, one that can be found wherever cultures caution against staring too long into what resists clarity. And this principle extends beyond folklore into the structure of the psyche itself, where certain thoughts, memories, or perceptions require indirect approach in order to be integrated safely. A concept explored across ancient traditions under different names, and later echoed by Jung's observation that what we resist consciously often returns with greater force unconsciously, while what we allow to remain symbolic can coexist without disturbance. And in this way, the myth serves as a guide for how attention should be shaped during vulnerable mental states, such as fatigue, solitude, or the threshold of sleep, times when the brain's emotional circuits are more active than its analytical ones. And cross-culturally, this understanding appears with gentle consistency. In Greek mystery traditions where seekers encountered truths through ritual rather than direct explanation, in Egyptian cosmology where hidden forms govern the night journey of the soul, and in Taoist philosophy where the unseen was approached through balance rather than domination, all suggesting that night consciousness requires a different kind of wisdom, one that allows mystery to exist without extracting it. And in South Asia, this wisdom often found expression through stories rather than doctrine, embedding psychological insight within narrative imagery that could be absorbed rather than debated. And this absorption is remarkably effective, because the sleeping mind engages metaphor directly, without the resistance of logic, learning through atmosphere rather than instruction. And modern neuroscience supports this effectiveness, observing that during low arousal states, such as pre-sleep relaxation, the brain's default mode network becomes more active, integrating emotion, memory, and meaning in a fluid stream. The same stream myths were designed to enter, and perhaps this explains why so many folktales emphasize restraint at night, not naming, not staring, not wandering alone, because these boundaries preserved mental stability in conditions where sensory information was incomplete, preventing the mind from overcompensating through fear-based imagination. And you may notice how even now, in familiar surroundings, darkness invites internal imagery, how a quiet room becomes a canvas for thought, and how gentle guidance can either soothe or agitate this process. And this is where myths performed their most important function, not as explanations of the external world, but as caretakers of internal experience, offering shared symbols that reassured the mind it was not alone in its sensations. And when we consider the woman who should not be looked at through this lens, she becomes a compassionate figure standing at the edge of awareness, reminding the listener when to retreat not out of weakness, but out of self-preservation. And similar figures exist worldwide, from the veiled goddesses of Roman rites to the hidden kami of Japanese forests, all reinforcing the same lesson in different languages. that what is partially seen can remain peaceful if left partially unknown. And as this lesson settles deeper, it may invite a soft question. How often in modern life do we strain to illuminate every shadow, filling silence with noise, processing every sensation into meaning? And could this constant illumination be what disturbs rest more than darkness ever did? Because ancient myths were not produced by ignorance alone. They were shaped by long observation of how the mind behaves under different conditions, and their survival suggests they addressed realities that persist despite technological change. And so, as you continue to drift, the myth transforms from story into sensation, encouraging a relaxed form of awareness, one that allows thoughts to approach and recede without pursuit, mirroring the attentional rhythm that leads naturally towards sleep. And in this way, the forbidden gaze dissolves into something gentler, an invitation to lower perception from sharp focus to soft presence, allowing the night to hold what does not need to be held by you. As attention softens and releases its need to linger, the landscape of awareness expands outward, moving gently from the intimate boundary of perception into the open spaces that long unsettled the human mind after sunset. And among these spaces, few carried as much quiet significance as the road, especially when empty, stretching beyond the safety of habitation into uncertainty. And in South Asian folklore, roads after dark were not feared for what rushed toward the traveler, but for what followed at an unnoticed distance, a presence sensed through rhythm rather than sight, giving rise to the enduring idea of spirits that follow empty roads, not to attack, but to observe, testing whether the traveler maintained calm awareness or surrendered to unease. And these stories did not describe pursuit with urgency, but accompaniment with patience, a shadow matching pace, a shift in sound that mirrored footsteps, reinforcing the notion that isolation invites reflection as much as it invites vulnerability. And from an anthropological perspective, roads represent liminal zones, spaces between destinations where the mind has fewer anchors, allowing internal narratives to surface more freely. And at night, when visibility narrows and sound carries farther, these narratives become especially vivid, shaping sensations that felt external but arose internally. And similar interpretations appear across cultures, in Roman beliefs where crossroads were governed by threshold deities, in Norse traditions where travelers left offerings before night journeys, and in Native American lore where paths held memory, responding to those who walked with respect or impatience, all recognizing that movement through darkness alters psychology, and evolutionary biology supports this understanding, noting that solitary nighttime travel increased risk, causing the brain to heighten alertness while simultaneously seeking patterns for reassurance. And myths provided those patterns, transforming anxiety into something structured, something predictable, in the form of a following presence that responded not to fear, but to behavior. And in many versions of these South Asian tales, those who walked steadily, without haste or hesitation, felt the presence recede, while those who stopped, listened too closely, or turned repeatedly experienced rising unease, illustrating an intuitive grasp of how anxiety feeds itself through attention, creating the sensation of being pursued even when nothing external changes. And as you rest with this image, You may recall moments when walking alone felt neutral until a single thought changed the rhythm, causing the mind to scan shadows more sharply. And this change, subtle yet powerful, reveals how much perception is shaped by expectation rather than stimulus. And myths, rather than denying this truth, framed it into narrative advice. Walk calmly, do not invite the presence by focusing on it. Acknowledge the space without surrendering to imagination. And this guidance parallels modern cognitive behavioral techniques that encourage maintaining steady movement and neutral thought during anxious states, suggesting that these ancient stories encoded practical psychological strategies long before formal theory existed. And across cultures, the idea of being followed without being harmed appears again and again, not as a threat, but as a test of composure, from Chinese tales of night companions to African stories of walking spirits that mirror the traveler's pace, all reinforcing the lesson that inner balance determines outer experience. And as the road theme continues to unfold, it becomes clear that these myths were less about the dangers of the path and more about the mind's response to liminality, the discomfort of being between places, between identities, between states of consciousness, much like the state between waking and sleep where you find yourself now. And perhaps this is why the image of an empty road feels both unsettling and calming. Unlimited possibility contained in stillness. And if you notice the steady cadence of breath now, it mirrors the advice embedded in these tales, to keep moving smoothly through uncertainty, to allow the presence of the unknown without engaging it directly, and in doing so, to discover that the sensation of being followed fades naturally when attention turns inward, away from imagined pursuit and toward grounded rhythm, leaving behind not fear, but a quiet sense of passage, as though the road itself has recognized your calm and chosen to walk on alone. With the road now stretching behind you like a softened memory, the narrative turns gently toward the idea that unsettled humans across all cultures, the in-between, those moments and places that did not belong fully to one state or another, because uncertainty has always asked more of the mind than danger itself. And in South Asian folklore, empty roads at night were only one expression of this broader theme, a recognition that thresholds amplify awareness, drawing attention inward while limiting external reassurance. And this pattern appears wherever humans paused between known points, at crossroads, rivers, forest edges, and the hours just before dawn, times when predictability loosens and imagination fills the gaps. And anthropologists note that these liminal spaces often inspired rituals and stories precisely because they activated deeper emotional processing, requiring symbolic frameworks to prevent anxiety from escalating unchecked. And in Roman tradition, gods of thresholds oversaw doorways and transitions, while in Norse belief, twilight environments were linked to encounters that tested resolve. And among many indigenous American tribes, transitional spaces were approached with intentional mindfulness, acknowledging that the land itself responded differently during moments of change. And from a neuroscientific perspective, liminality disrupts the brain's predictive coding systems, reducing its ability to anticipate what comes next, which can trigger heightened alertness accompanied by a sense of vulnerability. And yet, this same disruption also allows creativity, insight, and emotional integration to occur, which is why night, crossroads, and journeys have always played such central roles in myth and psychology alike. And the stories of spirits that follow empty roads serve as training narratives for navigating this uncertain mental terrain, encouraging steady behavior and calm attention rather than control or confrontation. And it is worth noticing how these myths rarely describe harm as inevitable, instead placing responsibility gently on the traveler's internal state, suggesting that fear itself intensifies the experience, while composure dissolves it, an idea echoed in modern understandings of anxiety and panic, where resistance often strengthens distress, while acceptance eases it. And as you sink deeper into stillness, this insight may feel familiar, how certain thoughts lose their power when observed softly rather than chased, how uncertainty becomes tolerable when allowed to exist without resolution. And this approach is mirrored in many spiritual traditions that emphasize surrender over mastery, from Buddhist mindfulness, which teaches observation without attachment, to Taoist philosophy, which honors flowing with conditions rather than opposing them, all reinforcing the ancient realization that the mind's response to the in-between determines whether it becomes a place of fear or growth. And perhaps this explains why myths associated with transitions are often calmer than expected, because they were designed not to excite, but to guide attention smoothly across psychological gaps, helping individuals pass through altered states safely, whether those states were physical journeys, seasonal changes, or the nightly descent into sleep. And in this way, the road stories blend seamlessly into the larger sleep narrative you are experiencing now, where consciousness loosens its grip on certainty while remaining anchored by rhythm and continuity, and the absence of clear boundaries becomes an invitation rather than a threat. And if you reflect gently, you may notice that much of modern restlessness arises from discomfort with transitions, from filling every pause with stimulus, every silence with sound, disrupting the brain's natural integrative processes, whereas ancient myths trusted pauses, allowing the mind to reorganize itself quietly, guided by simple symbols rather than constant explanation. And as this understanding settles, the in-between no longer feels empty but supportive, a place where awareness can drift without falling, and the spirits that once followed now seem less like watchers and more like reflections of attention itself, dissolving as soon as movement becomes smooth and unforced, leaving you alone on the path in the best possible way, accompanied only by steady breath and the gentle continuity of thought. As the sense of movement gradually stills, attention drifts toward places where humans once rested beneath open skies, and among these, few carry as much quiet instruction as the trees that framed village life in South Asia, offering shade, food, and gathering space during the day, yet invoking restraint at night, giving rise to the enduring caution of the tree you never sleep under, a phrase passed not through dramatic legend, but through practical tradition, woven into daily advice and subtly reinforced by story. And the warning was rarely explained in detail, because its power lay in familiarity rather than fear, suggesting that certain natural forms gathered more than leaves and branches after sunset. And while modern interpretations might search for supernatural implications, the deeper origin rests in observation, where elders noticed how sleeping beneath dense canopies disrupted rest, amplifying sounds, limiting airflow. and creating sensory ambiguity that unsettled the nervous system. Yet observation alone does not fully account for the symbolic weight the tree acquired, because across cultures, trees have long represented vertical connection, roots buried in unseen depth, trunks anchored in the present, and canopies reaching towards sky, making them natural symbols of consciousness itself. And in Vedic tradition, sacred trees functioned as meeting points between worlds, while Celtic lore treated ancient oaks as keepers of memory, and African mythologies often located spirits within groves rather than individual beings, recognizing the collective presence of place. And this symbolic richness influenced how people related to trees at different times of day, welcoming their shelter in sunlight, but respecting their mystery in darkness. When imagination filled the vertical space with unseen movement, and in South Asian folklore, sleeping beneath certain trees at night was believed to disturb dreams, causing vivid imagery or restlessness, an experience modern sleep psychology would attribute to heightened sensory input and subconscious alertness, where unfamiliar sounds, shifting shadows, and temperature changes prevent the brain from reaching deeper rest cycles. Yet rather than articulating these mechanisms scientifically, the culture encoded the observation into myth, transforming a pattern into guidance that could be remembered easily. And as you listen now, you may recall how sleeping in open or unfamiliar environments produces lighter sleep, a phenomenon evolutionary biologists describe as the sentinel effect, where part of the brain remains alert to detect potential threats. And beneath dense tree cover, this effect intensifies as the mind cannot easily interpret the environment. And over generations, such experiences shaped stories that framed restlessness as an external influence rather than an internal state, offering narrative comfort by externalizing the cause of disrupted sleep. And this is why the myth does not accuse the sleeper of weakness, but simply acknowledges the tree as an active participant, reminding the community that rest requires not just time, but place. And similar beliefs appear worldwide. In Japanese Shinto, where certain trees were marked as spiritually potent and approached with care. In Native American traditions, where specific groves were sites of ritual rather than rest. And in Polynesian cultures, where trees housed ancestral presence, all reinforcing the idea that nature holds different qualities depending on context and intention. And as this understanding settles, the caution becomes less restrictive and more caring. A recognition that the mind needs environments matched to its rhythms, especially when transitioning into vulnerability, such as sleep. And perhaps this resonates now, as you feel the subtle desire to be enclosed yet undisturbed, supported without sensory overload. And in this way, the tree you never sleep under transforms from taboo into wisdom, reminding you that rest flourishes where awareness can soften fully, free from the need to interpret every rustle or movement overhead. And as the canopy of thought gradually thins, leaving open sky within the mind, the body responds naturally, sinking further into ease, guided by an understanding that ancient myths always held gently, that where you rest shapes how deeply you can let go. With the image of shelter now refined into something quieter, the narrative lingers among roots and canopies, exploring why trees, more than many natural forms, became mirrors for collective memory, because they stand still while generations pass, absorbing human presence without recording it in words. And in South Asian landscapes, certain trees marked boundaries between villages, fields, and wilderness, their permanence offering orientation by day and evoking contemplation by night. And this dual role shaped myths that treated them as both guardians and thresholds, respected for their reliability yet approached with restraint during altered states of awareness, such as fatigue or darkness. And this careful balance finds echoes across cultures, where the world tree appears in Norse cosmology as Yggdrasil, holding realms together, while in Mesoamerican tradition, the ceiba tree connected underworld, earth, and sky, and in Chinese folklore, ancient trees were believed to accumulate spiritual significance through long exposure to human emotion, functioning as silent witnesses rather than active agents. And these symbolic roles align closely with cognitive science observations about environmental cues and memory, noting that stable landmarks help organize experience, becoming anchors for emotional association, so that over time, certain places begin to carry felt meaning independent of conscious belief. And this is why communities often agree without discussion that some trees feel restful while others feel watchful, because shared experiences, layered across years, imprint atmosphere into place, forming what anthropologists call cultural landscapes, where meaning is stored spatially. And the myth of the tree you never sleep under becomes a protective expression of this understanding, acknowledging that certain locations stimulate the mind rather than soothe it, especially at night, when internal imagery is heightened. And modern neuroscience supports this by demonstrating how unfamiliar or symbolically charged environments keep the hippocampus alert, scanning for novelty rather than allowing deep rest. And rather than suppressing this response, myths named it, turning restlessness into something external that could be accommodated through choice of place. And this approach reflects a broader ancient strategy, working with the nervous system instead of against it, shaping behavior gently through story, allowing the mind to feel justified in its sensations rather than conflicted. And as you lie listening now, perhaps in a space chosen for comfort, you may notice how familiarity relaxes perception, how known sounds fade into background, allowing awareness to drift inward. And this contrast highlights the wisdom embedded in these tales, recognizing that the quality of attention during sleep matters as much as duration, because the brain consolidates memory and emotion most effectively when it feels both safe and unobserved. And across traditions, this insight found symbolic language, from African myths where trees absorbed community sorrow and joy, to Greek belief in dryads that embodied the life of individual trees, all reflecting the intuition that places hold psychological residue, influencing those who rest within them. And when myths advised caution, they did so not to restrict freedom, but to honor this subtle reciprocity between mind and environment, teaching discernment rather than fear. And as the symbolism deepens, the tree transforms from an external object into a reminder of internal structure, of roots representing unconscious memory, trunk representing waking awareness, and canopy representing imagination. And sleeping too close to this vertical axis during vulnerable states may blur boundaries the mind prefers to keep gently distinct. And so, the collective memory encoded in these stories guides attention toward rest that is horizontal rather than vertical, grounded rather than expansive, supporting surrender rather than stimulation. And as this thought unfolds slowly, it may invite a gentle release, a sense that the mind no longer needs to evaluate its surroundings, but can trust the chosen space to hold it, allowing the internal canopy to quiet, and in that quiet, to drift naturally toward deeper rest, supported by centuries of observation transformed into simple, enduring wisdom. As the mind settles into the safety of chosen ground, attention begins to notice absence rather than presence. The way vision softens at the edges and movement becomes suggestion instead of form. And in this softened awareness, one of the most enduring night myths emerges quietly: the shadow that was not human, a phrase less concerned with fear than with recognition, acknowledging that not every shape perceived in darkness aligns with expectation. And in South Asian folk tradition, shadows were rarely described as aggressive. Instead, they were portrayed as incomplete, moving slightly out of rhythm, lacking weight or intention. And this subtle difference is important because it mirrors how the sensory system behaves when information is limited, forcing the brain to predict rather than confirm, creating impressions that feel external but originate in internal processing. And cultures across the world noticed this phenomenon, embedding it into story to normalize the experience rather than alarm it, with Greek thinkers describing shadows as metaphors for perception itself, filtering reality through imperfect senses, while Chinese philosophy viewed shadow and light as necessary companions, each defining the other through balance. And African oral traditions often treated shadows as remnants of movement, echoes rather than beings, reminding listeners that not all impressions deserve response. And modern neuroscience offers clarity here, explaining how low-light conditions reduce visual acuity, causing the brain to rely more heavily on pattern recognition, a system optimized for speed rather than accuracy, leading to misinterpretations that resolve quickly once attention shifts or light changes. Yet without this scientific framework, early humans still recognized that these experiences were common and transient, choosing to encode them into myth rather than treat them as personal anomalies. And this choice reduced anxiety by creating shared expectation, allowing individuals to remain calm when perception played tricks, trusting that the sensation would pass without consequence. And the shadow that was not human thus becomes a collective reassurance, a reminder that the mind fills gaps creatively, especially at night, when imagination and memory share the stage. And this is why many tales emphasize not reacting, not calling out, and not staring, but allowing the shadow to dissolve on its own, mirroring mindfulness practices centuries before they were named. And as you listen now, you may notice how peripheral vision shifts subtly even in stillness, how the mind suggests motion where none exists, and how quickly this suggestion fades when not pursued, revealing the gentle impermanence of perception. And similar understandings appear in Buddhist thought, where illusions are observed without attachment, and in Native American traditions that describe seeing without naming, allowing experience to pass without fixation, all reinforcing the idea that awareness can be fluid rather than grasping, especially during transitions toward sleep. And the myth carries this lesson forward, not to deny the strange sensations of night, but to contextualize them, reducing their emotional charge by placing them within a familiar symbolic frame. And from an evolutionary perspective, this approach was adaptive, preventing the nervous system from expending energy on false alarms, conserving resources for genuine threat. And as you sink deeper into rest, this conservation becomes palpable. As the body releases tension and perception loosens its grip, and the shadow that once seemed present loses definition, becoming simply part of the background of thought. And perhaps this transformation mirrors the broader purpose of myth itself, to guide the mind through ambiguity without forcing resolution, allowing uncertain impressions to remain what they are, fleeting, incomplete, and ultimately harmless. And in recognizing this, the night becomes less populated by imagined presences and more spacious, offering room for consciousness to rest without effort, accompanied by the quiet understanding that not everything perceived asks for meaning, and not every shadow requires interpretation. As perception continues to soften, the narrative widens into open land, where boundaries thin and the horizon feels closer than distance should allow. And in these spaces, another quiet myth takes shape, the feeling of eyes watching from fields, an experience reported not as sight, but as sensation, a subtle awareness of being observed without any clear source. And in agrarian South Asian cultures, where fields represented both sustenance and exposure, nighttime vigilance carried practical importance. As crops required protection and open land offered little cover, and this reality shaped stories that framed the fields as attentive rather than threatening, sensitive to movement, sound, and intention. And while modern perspectives might label this sensation as paranoia, ancient understanding treated it as heightened situational awareness, an adaptive response to vulnerability in open environments. And similar interpretations appear across cultures, with African farming communities speaking of land that notices footsteps, Native American tribes honoring plains as listening spaces, and ancient Greek mythology personifying fields through deities who guarded growth and cycles, all suggesting that being seen was part of the human relationship with land, not a sign of danger, but of connection. And neuroscience supports this interpretation, noting that the human brain evolved to detect gaze and attention quickly. As awareness of being observed once influenced survival decisions, particularly in exposed terrain, and this circuitry remains active today, even when no social or predatory threat exists, creating the sensation of unseen eyes during quiet moments, especially at night when visual input is limited. And rather than dismissing this sensation, myths acknowledged it, offering it meaning that soothed rather than alarmed, describing the fields as witnesses rather than watchers, preserving the sense of reciprocity between humans and their environment. And this framing reduced anxiety by transforming exposure into familiarity, reminding listeners that they had always been observed by land, sky, and season, and yet had belonged among them nonetheless. And as you listen now, notice how stillness can feel attentive, how silence itself seems to hold awareness, and how this feeling does not require a source to be real, because it arises from within the mind, a result of the brain scanning for subtle cues. And when ancient stories suggested that eyes watched from fields, they were naming this internal process, externalizing it into a shared narrative that made the sensation easier to live with. And this approach aligns with modern psychological techniques that encourage acknowledging sensations without assigning threat, allowing the nervous system to settle naturally. And across traditions, this same principle appears in Japanese folklore, where landscapes possess presence, in Polynesian belief, where ocean and land remain aware of those who move upon them, and in Egyptian cosmology, where the world itself witnessed human action, all fostering a relationship of respect rather than fear. And perhaps this is why such myths often emphasize routine, familiarity, and mutual presence, suggesting that being seen is simply part of existing, not a judgment or pursuit. And as the sense of being watched softens into a recognition of being held within a larger environment, tension releases, posture settles, and awareness drifts inward again, leaving open land behind without urgency, carrying forward the understanding that attention does not always need an observer, that awareness can exist without intent, and that the feeling of eyes in the dark is often the mind acknowledging its own alertness before allowing itself to rest. As attention retreats from open fields and returns gently toward shelter, the narrative settles into places meant for rest, and yet remembered for unease, giving form to the idea of homes marked by invisible fear, not as haunted structures, but as locations where something unspoken lingered, a heaviness sensed rather than explained. And in South Asian folk understanding, such homes were rarely blamed for dramatic events. Instead, they were described as having absorbed unresolved emotion, grief, conflict, or prolonged vigilance, creating atmospheres that disturbed sleep long after the original cause faded. And this interpretation aligns closely with modern psychological insight, recognizing that environments accumulate emotional association through repeated experience, shaping perception and mood without conscious awareness. And cross-culturally, this idea appears with remarkable consistency. In Japanese belief, where certain rooms are avoided after nightfall, in African traditions that acknowledge places touched by sorrow as requiring rest, and in Roman customs where homes underwent cleansing rituals to restore psychological balance, all reflecting an intuitive grasp of how space and emotion intertwine. Because human memory is not stored only in the mind, it is reinforced by context, scent, light, and sound, creating feedback loops that influence nervous system responses automatically. And when myths described invisible fear, they were naming this feedback, offering language for sensations that felt real but could not be rationalized easily. And by doing so, they prevented individuals from internalizing blame, affirming that unease could belong to place rather than person. And neuroscience supports this practice, showing how the amygdala associates environments with prior stress, activating alertness even in the absence of threat. And without symbolic explanation, such reactions could feel personal or unpredictable, whereas myth externalized them into shared understanding, allowing communities to respond with collective adaptation rather than private anxiety. And this adaptation often took the form of quiet respect, altering routines, introducing light, sound, or ritual to reset the emotional tone of the space. And this mirrors therapeutic practices today that focus on environmental grounding to restore a sense of safety, suggesting once again that ancient stories encoded effective strategies long before formal terminology existed. And as you listen now, perhaps you sense how certain spaces feel neutral while others carry memory, how familiarity soothes while unfamiliar quiet unsettles. And this awareness does not require belief in unseen forces, only recognition of how deeply perception is shaped by history, both personal and collective, and across cultures. Acknowledgement of invisible fear serves to validate experience without escalating it, framing discomfort as understandable rather than alarming. And perhaps this is why such myths avoid dramatic imagery, focusing instead on atmosphere, an undefined pressure that dissipates with time and care. And as the narrative continues to deepen, the image of the uneasy home becomes less about threat and more about sensitivity, highlighting how the human mind remains receptive to traces of emotion long after events conclude. And in recognizing this, a gentle acceptance emerges, allowing awareness to soften rather than resist. And with resistance released, the body follows naturally, loosening its vigilance and settling into rest, held by the quiet understanding that unease does not define space permanently, and that safety often returns through patience, familiarity, and the simple passage of night into morning. As the sense of place grows quieter and more familiar, the narrative turns from what is seen and felt to what is heard, because long before vision was trusted in darkness, sound carried meaning, shaping awareness in ways both subtle and profound. And from this sensitivity emerged the idea of the sound that meant you were chosen, not chosen for harm, but selected for attention, a concept present in South Asian folklore where certain nighttime sounds were believed to single someone out, marking a moment of heightened awareness rather than destiny. And these sounds were rarely loud or dramatic, often described as a soft call, a single footstep, a distant knock, or the faint repetition of one's name, heard just once. And the instruction embedded in these stories was not to respond immediately, because responding transformed perception into action, while listening without engagement allowed the moment to pass. And from a neurological perspective, this belief aligns closely with how the sleeping brain processes sound, as auditory input remains partially active during rest, especially during early sleep stages, allowing significant sounds to surface into awareness while filtering out the familiar, a system designed to protect without fully waking. And when unfamiliar, our sounds breach this filter, they can feel personal, even intentional, because the brain assigns significance to novelty under low sensory conditions. And ancient cultures noticed this effect, choosing to frame it symbolically rather than pathologically, creating myths that guided behavior without inducing fear. And similar understandings appear globally. In Celtic lore, where hearing one's name at night signaled a liminal state. In Japanese tradition, where phantom sounds were treated as tests of mindfulness. And in indigenous American belief, where night calls were messages to pause rather than pursue, all reflecting an appreciation for sound as a boundary between consciousness states. And this appreciation was deeply practical, because reacting impulsively to ambiguous sounds increased risk, while calm assessment preserved safety. And so the myth taught restraint, encouraging stillness until clarity returned. And modern sleep research echoes this wisdom, noting that anxious interpretation of nocturnal sounds increases arousal, prolonging wakefulness, while neutral acknowledgement allows the nervous system to settle. And as you rest now, you may notice how sound behaves differently, how distant noises feel closer, how silence feels charged with expectation, and how the mind briefly searches for pattern before relaxing again. And this process is natural, a remnant of ancient vigilance embedded in auditory pathways. And rather than resisting it, myths offered a comforting explanation, suggesting that hearing something did not require action, only awareness. And by externalizing the experience into story, they reduced its emotional intensity, allowing listeners to trust their instincts without surrendering to them. And this trust is essential for sleep, because the brain must feel permitted to disengage, while remaining confident that significant information will still reach consciousness if needed. And the myth of being chosen by sound reassured individuals that awareness could exist without responsibility, that hearing did not demand response. And as this idea settles, the body often responds with release, the shoulders lowering, the breath deepening, and sounds returning to background texture rather than focal points. And across cultures, this transformation was the goal, not silence, but comfort with listening, a state where the world could communicate softly without disturbing rest. And in this way, the sound that once felt meaningful dissolves into the greater quiet, leaving behind the calm understanding that not every call is meant to be answered, especially when the night is guiding awareness gently inward rather than outward. As sound fades into a gentler background and listening becomes effortless, attention turns toward language itself, to the quiet weight words carry when the world is dark, giving rise to the enduring caution of names you never say at night, a belief shared across South Asian folklore not as superstition, but as intuitive psychology, recognizing that speech alters internal state, sharpening awareness and anchoring attention where rest would prefer it to remain fluid. And in many regions, elders advised restraint in naming people, places, or unseen forces after sunset, not because words summon danger, but because speaking fixed perception, collapsing ambiguity into form, which could agitate the mind when sleep was near. And this understanding appears repeatedly across cultures, in Mesopotamian traditions where certain names were reserved for ritual daylight use, in Egyptian belief where naming granted essence and permanence, and in Jewish mystical thought where words shaped reality itself, all pointing to the same insight, that language solidifies experience, transforming sensation into narrative, and neuroscience supports this ancient intuition, showing how verbalization activates cortical regions associated with analysis and memory encoding, pulling the brain out of its naturally diffuse nighttime mode and into focused cognition. And when myths warned against naming, they were preserving mental permeability, allowing thoughts to remain associative rather than linear, a state more conducive to rest, dreams, and emotional integration. And from a Jungian perspective, names carry archetypal charge, invoking collective imagery that can stimulate the unconscious, which is why naming fears or unknowns at night can amplify their presence internally, while leaving them unnamed allows them to remain symbolic and less intrusive. And similar guidance appears in Japanese folklore, where certain entities were acknowledged indirectly, and in African traditions, where naming was an act of power used carefully, reflecting an awareness that words influence emotional reality. And as you listen now, you may notice how the mind relaxes when words soften into sound, when thought drifts without attaching labels. And this drift mirrors the ancient preference for silence after dark, not as emptiness, tea as a medium for internal reorganization. And perhaps this is why so many spiritual traditions incorporate chanting or mantra instead of ordinary speech at night, using sound without explicit meaning to soothe rather than focus the mind. And the myth of withheld names functions similarly, encouraging vocal restraint to protect psychological equilibrium. And as the night deepened, this restraint preserved the gentle state between waking and sleep, where imagination could explore freely without being anchored by definition. And when names were saved for daylight, they returned with clarity and purpose, reinforcing the natural rhythm between articulation and rest. And this rhythm remains present within you now, as silence feels supportive rather than empty, holding thoughts loosely without requiring expression. And in this way, the caution against naming becomes less about fear and more about care, a way of honoring the mind's need for softness during vulnerable states. And as language loosens its grip, awareness spreads evenly, unburdened by labels, allowing the subconscious to surface and settle without interruption, guided by the quiet wisdom that some things are best understood not by being named, but by being allowed to pass gently through the night. As naming gives way to silence and awareness becomes diffuse, the individual myths begin to soften around the edges, no longer standing apart as separate lessons, but merging gradually into a single, continuous understanding. Because beneath their varied imagery, they have always described the same interior landscape, the way the human mind responds to darkness, uncertainty, and rest. And in this merging, the woman who should not be looked at becomes indistinguishable from the shadow that was not human, each representing boundaries of perception rather than external figures, while the empty road, the watching fields, and the sound that meant you were chosen collapse into shared symbols of heightened attention during liminal states. And this convergence reveals why similar stories arose independently across the world, not through imitation, but through shared cognition. As human nervous systems responded similarly to environmental conditions that challenged certainty, and anthropology confirms this pattern, showing how myths evolved as emotional technologies, tools designed to regulate arousal, preserve social cohesion, and support rest in conditions where survival depended on calm assessment rather than panic. And religious symbolism across cultures reflects this function, portraying darkness not as evil, but as gestational, a state of transformation where form dissolves and reorganizes, as seen in Egyptian night journeys of the sun, Vedic cycles of dissolution, and Polynesian creation stories that emerge from quiet void rather than chaos, all honoring darkness as necessary rather than threatening. And modern psychology reframes these same processes as memory consolidation, emotional processing, and subconscious integration, activities that occur most deeply during rest, particularly sleep. When the brain disengages from external stimulus and turns inward, and myths guided this inward turn gently, offering symbolic companions rather than instructions, allowing the mind to relax into uncertainty with trust. And as you rest now, perhaps you notice how distinctions blur, how stories feel less like narratives and more like textures. And this blurring mirrors the intended outcome, guiding attention away from detail and toward flow. Because sleep unfolds most naturally when focus releases, and across cultures, elders understood this intuitively, using calm repetition, familiar imagery, and unresolved questions to soothe rather than stimulate. And even now, the curiosity loops woven through these stories are designed to unfold slowly, not seeking resolution, but encouraging the mind to drift, trusting that insight arises without effort. And in this merging stage, fear loses specificity, becoming simply alertness without object, which often resolves into calm once the body recognizes there is nothing to respond to. And this recognition is the quiet reward these myths offer, not revelation, but release. And as the narrative continues its gentle descent, awareness may feel expansive yet stable, held by the continuity of centuries of observation distilled into simple guidance, reminding you that darkness has always been a place of listening and learning, not of confrontation. And in this understanding, the separate fits other without strain, leaving the subconscious free to complete its work, supported by the same ancient patterns that have guided humanity through countless nights into morning. As the last distinctions dissolve and thought becomes spacious, the narrative comes to rest where it has always been leading, within the quiet continuity of human memory, where myth, mind, and biology overlap so seamlessly that separation no longer feels necessary. And here, darkness is no longer an absence to be navigated, but a medium through which the subconscious has always spoken, carrying forward patterns shaped by countless nights lived before this one. Nights when people listened more than they spoke, sensed more than they named, and trusted the body's wisdom to guide awareness into rest. And the myths that once stood gently at the edges of villages, roads, trees, fields, homes, and sound now settle inward, revealing themselves as reflections of an internal architecture shared by all, a structure designed not for fear, but for balance, regulating attention, conserving energy, and allowing renewal. And modern science affirms what ancient stories implied, that sleep is not a passive state, but an active process of integration, where experiences are sorted, emotions softened, and meaning reorganized beneath conscious awareness. And myths acted as permission slips for this process, reassuring the mind that it could let go without losing vigilance entirely, that it could surrender sharp focus while remaining safe. And across civilizations, from Mesopotamia to South Asia, from Africa to the Americas, this reassurance took many forms, yet always pointed toward the same quiet truth, that rest is a shared human inheritance, protected by symbols passed from generation to generation. And as you drift now, perhaps you sense how the body responds when vigilance eases, how breath finds its own rhythm, how thoughts elongate and lose urgency, becoming impressions rather than demands. And this state is not emptiness, but fullness without strain, the condition these myths were designed to support. And in recognizing this, the night no longer needs explanation, nor does the darkness require definition, because meaning is already present in the experience itself, unfolding gently as consciousness recedes. And the final understanding these stories offer is not a lesson to be remembered, but a feeling to be trusted, that beneath awareness runs a stable current shaped by history, biology, and shared imagination, guiding each mind safely into sleep night after night. And in this shared inheritance, there is comfort, because it reminds you that nothing about this descent is new or solitary, that countless others have entered it the same way, carried by the same quiet patterns and emerged restored. And so, as the narrative ends, it does so not with an answer, but with a settling, the calm recognition that darkness has always been a companion to rest, and that within it, the human mind remembers how to release itself naturally when allowed.